Before we begin, let me welcome you to Family Shadows, a place where stories live and breathe, where fathers and mothers, sons and daughters walk through moments that change them forever. If you find yourself here often, if you believe in the kind of stories that carry both a sting and a lesson, then maybe you'll want to stay a while. And perhaps, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Today's story is called, I Paid for Their Dream Home, but They Said I Wasn't Welcome in It. When you've worked with your hands for 40 years, you learn to measure your life not in years, but in bricks and beams, in the creak of wood settling into its place, in the lines on your palms that tell you you've built something worth leaving behind. For Thomas Reed, 60 years old and finally retired from the construction business, that something was not a building. It was his family. And yet, strangely enough, what he loved most about building homes was imagining the people who would live in them. He'd stand back after a job was finished, picturing some little girl racing down the hallway to greet her father, a mother planting flowers in the front yard, a golden retriever barking in the driveway. That was the magic of his work. Every house had a heartbeat, even before the first family moved in. So when his son Mark got married, Thomas thought, why not give them the kind of home I always imagined for someone else? Mark was 33, with a young wife named Sophie and a 5-year-old daughter, Ella. They'd been renting a small, cramped apartment above a noisy pizza shop in town. Every time Thomas visited, he'd see Ella's toys stacked in the hallway because there wasn't enough room for them. He'd see Sophie cooking dinner in a kitchen no bigger than a closet. One Sunday afternoon, after Ella asked if they could visit a house with a backyard, Thomas sat in his armchair long after they'd left, staring at the photograph of Linda, his late wife, on the mantel. Linda had been gone for 12 years now, but her voice still lived inside his mind. She always wanted you to have your own garden, Thomas murmured to the picture. And she always said we should help the kids when we could. Helping the kids. The phrase meant more to Thomas than anything else, not because he believed in spoiling them, far from it, but because, in his heart, he felt a father's job was to give his children a head start in life. It started as a casual idea. One rainy Saturday morning, Thomas drove out past the suburbs, down a winding road lined with maple trees, and spotted a new development under construction. The homes were modern but warm, with wide porches and big windows. The sales agent, a cheerful woman in a red blazer, walked him through one of the model houses. It had an open kitchen, a sunlit living room, 3 bedrooms, and best of all, a fenced backyard with space for Ella to run and play. This one just feels right, Thomas said quietly. The agent smiled. It's been waiting for the right family. He nodded, thinking, it's been waiting for my family. Thomas didn't tell Mark or Sophie right away. He knew money was a sensitive topic. Mark had always been proud, maybe too proud, about making it on his own. But Thomas also knew the numbers. Mark's salary as a junior accountant barely covered their rent and expenses. Buying a house like this would take him a decade or more. One evening over coffee at the diner, Thomas brought it up. You remember that dream home you two talked about? He began. Mark chuckled. Yeah, Dad, we also talked about winning the lottery. What if, Thomas hesitated, what if you didn't have to wait for the lottery? Sophie looked up from her cup. What do you mean? I mean, I want to buy you a house. The silence at the table was thick enough to stir with a spoon. Dad, Mark began, shaking his head, that's a lot. I've been saving my whole life, Thomas said simply. Your mother and I planned for this. We wanted you to have a place to build your life. 2 months later, Thomas stood in the driveway of that same maple-lined street, a small manila envelope in his hands. Inside were 2 shiny brass keys. Mark and Sophie pulled up in their sedan, Ella bouncing in the back seat. Surprised, Thomas said, holding out the keys. Ella gasped, "Is this our house?" Thomas smiled, "It's yours." They all walked through the front door together. Sophie's eyes lit up at the kitchen island. Mark ran his hand along the banister. Ella twirled in the empty living room. And for a moment Thomas thought, this is it. This is the happiest I've been in years. What they didn't notice, or maybe didn't care to notice, was that the paperwork listed Thomas Reed as the sole owner, not out of selfishness but practicality. He told the agent, "I'll hold the title until they are ready to take on the mortgage themselves. That way they're not buried in debt." It was, in his mind, a safety net, a way to protect them if life took a wrong turn. But life, Thomas would soon learn, had its own way of twisting safety nets into snares. For the first few months, Thomas would stop by on Saturday mornings with donuts for Ella or help Mark fix a loose cabinet door. He'd sit on the back porch, sipping coffee while Sophie watered the flowers. But small signs began to appear. Sophie would glance at her watch when he arrived. Mark would say, "Maybe call before you come over next time." The warmth in their voices cooled little by little. Thomas told himself it was just them adjusting to their new space. After all, every family needed privacy. Still, something in his gut told him that the walls he'd built around them were starting to shut him out too. One evening, he brought over a new garden hose for Sophie. She took it with a polite smile but didn't invite him inside. From the doorway, he saw Ella waving from the kitchen, then Sophie gently closing the door. That night, Thomas lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan. "Linda," he whispered into the darkness, "tell me I did the right thing." But the only answer was the steady whirl of the blades overhead. Thomas woke to the sound of rain stitching at the window, a thin gray morning that made the town look half-finished. He brewed his coffee the way Linda used to, 2 scoops, a little cinnamon, and let the steam kiss his glasses while he stood by the sink. There was a soft ache behind his ribs, not pain so much as a warning. He'd learned to trust those whispers from his body. Houses settle, so do people. But sometimes the settling is a sign of something shifting underneath. He folded the morning paper, slid it to the side without reading, and looked at the calendar he kept on the wall by the door. 2 notes circled in blue pen, Ella's recital and Mark's performance review. He'd written them there weeks ago, cheerful little reminders that he was still part of their story. He traced a finger around the circles, then reached for his jacket and the small paper sack waiting on the counter. He'd baked banana bread at dawn, the way Linda did when she wanted to sweeten bad news or make a good day better. The loaf was still warm. He tucked it into the bag, added a jar of honey he'd bought from a man at the farmer's market, and headed out. The drive to Maple Grove took him past the diner, the feed store, the ball fields, and the old oak that split into 2 trunks like a wishbone. He had built half the roofs in this county. He could point at a gable and tell you which summer storm had taught him the trick to keeping it dry. There was a comfort in that sort of knowing. Wood and weather obeyed rules. Families, less so. He turned onto Mark Street and felt the now familiar mix of pride and unease. The development looked like a painting. Lawns mowed in tight stripes, flags on porches, sprinklers whispering arcs of water over flower beds. He parked at the curb. For a moment he simply sat, watching the way the house breathed, curtains lifting at an open window upstairs, a porch swing swaying on its chain. He climbed the steps, balancing the bag against his chest, and knocked with the gentle rap Linda had taught the children. 3 taps, soft as a heartbeat. He could hear music inside, a radio somewhere, the low hum of a vacuum, footsteps. The door opened halfway. Sophie stood there in a t-shirt and yoga pants, her hair pinned up. She smelled like lemon cleaner. She kept her hand on the edge of the door as if it might try to swing wider than she wanted. "Thomas," she said, surprise flattening the name. "We weren't expecting you." He lifted the sack like a peace offering. Banana bread, still warm, thought it might make a rainy morning nicer. Sophie's eyes moved to the sack, then back to his face. "That's kind, but it's not a good time. I'm in the middle of cleaning. We're reorganizing." "I won't be but a minute," Thomas said. "Is Ella around? I promised her I'd see her new tap shoes." He tipped his head, looking past Sophie into the hall. He saw the corner of a framed photo, first day in the house, keys shining like gold coins in their hands. He remembered that day the way a man remembers a song he once danced to and has not heard in years. "Ella's upstairs," Sophie said after a beat. "She's supposed to be tidying her room." She glanced over her shoulder. "Mark's on a call. It's a big week for him." She let the door open a few inches more, then caught it again. "Did you call first?" Thomas flushed, a boy's blush on an old man's cheeks. "I didn't. I was headed this way for nails at the hardware store. Thought I'd drop by since I was close." She nodded, small and tight. "We've talked about this, though. We need you to call. It throws the day off when you just appear. I know you mean well." "I do," he said, and hated how small his voice sounded. There came a clatter on the stairs, quick feet like hail. Ella's face appeared over the banister, bright as a new penny. "Grandpa," she sang, and Thomas felt the ache in his ribs loosen. She clomped down the last 3 steps in her tap shoes and flung herself toward the doorway. Sophie's hand shot out, catching her by the shoulder. "Sweetheart," she said, "Grandpa can't come in right now. Mommy's cleaning. You can say hello from the door." Ella pressed herself to the frame, toes clicking, mischief and sunlight bound up in a little body. "Do you want to hear my shuffle step, MS? Riley says I can almost keep the beat." "I'd love that," Thomas said. He bent and set the bag on the porch rail. "But only if your mom says it's okay." Sophie made a face that wasn't quite a smile. 2 minutes, she said. Then back upstairs. Ella danced a clumsy little pattern on the hardwood just inside the threshold, and Thomas clapped softly, careful not to step over the line between porch rug and hallway runner. He could smell the house, coffee, lemon cleaner, something floral from the laundry. He loved that smell. He hated that it had begun to feel as if it didn't belong to him. "Perfect," he said when she finished. "I brought you honey for your toast. The yellow jar from Mr. Purdy says his bees know the good flowers." "Bees have noses?" Ella asked, eyes round. "They do," Thomas said. "Thousands of tiny ones." He grinned. "Don't quote me to your teacher." Ella giggled and reached for the sack. Sophie's hand went to the bag first. "We'll take it," she said. "Thank you." "Of course," Thomas said. "Tell Mark I stopped by, and tell him I can fix the gate latch if it's still catching. It just needs a longer screw and a washer." "We have it handled," Sophie said quickly. Mark called a handyman. "Right," Thomas said, as if he had suggested something out of line. "Good." He lingered a second too long, and Sophie eased the door toward him, an inch of distance translated into a mile. "Thanks again," she said. "We'll see you Saturday at the recital." "Saturday," he repeated. "I'll be there." He walked back through the thin rain, the porch behind him sighing shut. In the car he sat a long moment, hands on the wheel, eyes blurring at the edges. A neighbor waved. He waved back, started the engine, and drove to the hardware store because he had said that's where he was going. He bought nails he did not need. At the diner, the waitress topped off his coffee and asked after his son. "Saw him on the porch the other day," she said. "Nice place they got there." "Nice," Thomas agreed. The word tasted like a lie told to a kind person. He went home with the nails and set them on the workbench beside his father's hammer, handle polished by 3 generations of hands. He stood there until the room felt crowded with men who had known how to fix things. That night he called Mark. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He hung up. He tried again the next evening. This time Mark answered, the noise of a game show chattering in the background. "Hey Dad, what's up? Just wanted to check in, make sure you got the bread." "We did, thanks." A pause, the sound of a muffled conversation away from the phone, then Mark again, distracted. "We're in the middle of dinner, actually." "I won't keep you," Thomas said. "Just wanted to say I'd be at Ella's recital. I'll get there early to save a seat." "About that," Mark said. The weight in his voice made Thomas sit. "Sophie's parents are coming, and her sister. We might be tight on seats this time." "I'll stand in the back," Thomas said too quickly. "I just want to see her." "Great, thanks, Dad." "I stopped by this morning," Thomas added before he could lose his courage. "I should have called first, I know, old habit." "Right," Mark said, hardly pausing. "It just helps us plan. Sophie gets anxious when the schedule changes." "Of course," Thomas said. "Tell her I'm sorry." After they hung up, Thomas went to the living room and pulled Linda's photograph from the mantel. It was the one from their 25th anniversary, her chin tilted, eyes laughing, his arm around her like he was anchoring a flag in wind. "You'd handle this better," he told the glass. "You'd make it feel easy." He set the picture back and tried to imagine what she would advise, perhaps to give it time, to be patient, to trust that the love he had invested would pay dividends in the end. The weeks slid by, small frictions accumulating like sawdust in a corner. At the recital, Thomas stood by the double doors and watched Ella tap her way across the stage, her grin so wide it threatened to split her face. He caught her eye once and pressed a hand to his heart. She mirrored him, quick as a bird. Afterward in the lobby, Sophie's parents clustered around with flowers, Sophie with a camera, Mark kneeling to tie the ribbon on Ella's bouquet. Thomas waited politely at the edge of the circle. When the group began to move toward the parking lot, he stepped forward with a card he had written in his neat draftsman's script. "For the star," he said. "Thanks, Dad," Mark said. "We're meeting everyone for ice cream. It's kind of a whole thing." "Of course," Thomas said. "Give her a hug from me." He walked to his truck alone, the card still warm from his hand. On Sunday, he visited the cemetery. The grass above Linda's stone was clipped close, rain laying it flat in a green sheen. He touched the carved letters of her name the way he used to trace her collarbone. "They're good people," he told the stone. "They're just careful with me. I don't know when I became something to handle." He smiled at his foolishness and the way a man will confess to a rock what he cannot to his son. "I'm trying not to take it personally," he said. "I'm failing." Monday brought a small emergency that would have once been a gift. Sophie texted in the late afternoon, "Do you know anyone who can look at the dryer? It's making a scraping noise." Thomas replied immediately, "I can be there at 6. We'll call first." When he called at 5:45, no one answered. At 6:05, his phone buzzed. "We got it sorted. Mark found someone on an app, thanks anyway." He stared at the message until the screen dimmed, then set the phone down like it might bruise. That night he called Frank. "You want me to say they are ungrateful so you don't have to?" Frank asked after listening for a long time without interrupting. "I want you to tell me I'm not going crazy," Thomas said. "You're not going crazy," Frank said. "You're lonely, and you're in the part of the story where the hero is too decent for his own good." "Don't call me a hero." "Okay, the protagonist then, the man who bought a house and now waits on the porch." Thomas rubbed his eyes. "I don't want to be on the porch. I want to be at the kitchen table." "Then you're going to have to knock in a way that gets the door opened," Frank said. "Or, if you'll forgive the metaphor, you'll have to remember who owns the hinges. I didn't buy the house to hold it over their heads." "No," Frank said gently. "You bought the house because you're the kind of man who can't look at a child without wanting to build her a backyard. Both things can be true, but sometimes people need to see the blueprint again to understand what's holding up the roof." Thomas said nothing. He could feel the shape of an answer in Frank's words, but it felt like a tool he didn't want to use. "Invite them to dinner," Frank said. "Neutral ground. Tell them how you feel without the history pressing down." "Maybe," Thomas said. "Or," Frank added, "just keep dropping bread and honey like a saint until they decide they've had enough sweetness." He let that sit. "You deserve better than you're getting, Tom. That's all I'm saying." On Wednesday, Thomas called Mark and asked if they could have lunch. They met at a place near Mark's office, booths upholstered in cracked red vinyl, ketchup bottles with the caps gummy from 100 squeezes. Mark looked tired, dark moons under his eyes. Thomas waited until the burgers arrived to say what he'd rehearsed. "I'm sorry if I've been underfoot," he began. "I know you and Sophie are trying to shape your own routines. I don't want to make that harder." Mark swallowed a bite and reached for his water. "It's not about you making anything harder," he said carefully. "It's about boundaries. Sophie's big on that. And you?" Mark stared at the salt shaker. "I think she's right. We need to be a family in our own way." "You are," Thomas said. "Nothing I do changes that. Showing up without calling does." "I can call," Thomas said quickly. "I can do that." Mark nodded. "Good, and another thing." He cleared his throat. "About the house. Sometimes it feels complicated, like it's not fully ours." "It's yours to live in," Thomas said. "That was the whole point." "But the deed," Mark said, flushing. "It's in your name." "For now," Thomas said. "Until you're ready to take on the payments, it protects you." "It also makes us feel like guests," Mark said, the words rushing now. "It's hard to decorate a room when you don't know if you'll be asked to move." Thomas leaned back, surprised. I've never, he stopped, considered. Do you think I would do that? I don't know, Mark said, and the honesty in it was a small, sharp thing. I don't want to find out by doing something that upsets you. What could you do that would upset me? Mark laughed without humor. Live differently than you and Mom did, buy a stupid couch, paint Ella's room purple, throw a loud party, make mistakes. I survived building houses for men who thought blueprints were suggestions. Thomas said softly, I can survive a purple room. Mark smiled despite himself. The server refilled their water. A family slid into the booth behind them, the father's laugh big and careless. Thomas looked at his son and saw the boy who used to fall asleep in the back of the truck on late job sites, saw the young man who cried in his arms at Linda's funeral, saw the father tying a ribbon on a bouquet for his own daughter. There were so many versions of Mark. Perhaps this one was learning how to separate and hadn't figured out how to do it without cutting. I don't want to lose you, Thomas said. You won't, Mark said, and for a moment Thomas believed him. The belief lasted until Saturday. Thomas called that morning as instructed. No answer. He texted. No reply. He drove to the hardware store, told himself he would not drive the extra 8 minutes to Maple Grove, then found his truck making the turn without consulting him. He parked at the curb and watched the house for a long while, like a man who had lost something he couldn't name. He saw movement in the front room, shadows pacing. He took a breath, grabbed a small bag with a new soccer ball for Ella and walked to the porch. He knocked his 3 soft knocks and waited. The door opened the same few inches, and Sophie stood there again, her expression composed, as if she had practiced it. Thomas, she said, I saw your missed call. I brought a ball for Ella, he said. Thought we could kick it around in the yard for a bit. Sophie exhaled. Today's not good, we have company. I won't intrude, Thomas said. We'll stay out back. Sophie stepped onto the porch, pulling the door nearly shut behind her. Thomas, she said, and the tone, the way his name bent in her mouth made his hands go cold. We've been talking about this for a while, about how to say it kindly. He stood straighter, the bag crinkled in his grip. Say what kindly? That it would be better, she said, choosing each word like a stone from a riverbed, if you didn't come by uninvited at all. Not just calling first, just not dropping in or visiting for a while. For a while, he repeated. A long while, she said. We need space to build our life, to parent our daughter, without feeling watched or judged or beholden. I don't judge you, he said, genuinely baffled. Beholden, I don't want you to feel that. But we do, Sophie said, eyes bright with a heat he hadn't expected. Every time you step in with a tool belt or a fix or an opinion, every time you remind us how the house got here, we feel it, and it's exhausting, Thomas. He blinked, the porch seemed to tilt. Down the street a dog barked, a lawn mower coughed to life. Where's Mark? He asked. Inside, she said, with our guests. He asked me to talk to you because when he tries, you hear only the parts you want. That's not fair, Thomas said. His voice sounded like someone else's. Sophie swallowed. You're a good man, I know that, but good men can still cast long shadows. We can't live under yours. He looked past her shoulder to the hallway. He could see the top of Ella's soccer cleats where they peeked from a basket. He pictured her feet inside them, tapping out rhythm on the floor. He wanted to say, I built this house for those shoes. Instead he said, so I'm not welcome, the words tasting like tin. For now, Sophie said, as if there were comfort in it. Not in the house, not at the door. If we want to meet, we can meet somewhere else. A park, maybe, neutral. And by we, I mean Mark and Ella. I'll come if it makes sense. He held the bag tighter until the plastic dug crescents into his palm. You're asking me not to see my granddaughter in the home I bought. I'm asking you to let us breathe, she said. I'm asking you to respect what we need. He looked down at the bag, and then at her. I have respected everything, he said, softly enough that she had to lean in to hear. I have bent until I worried something would snap. I do not want to be a problem in your life. Then don't be, she said, and though she flinched, she did not step back from the edge she had chosen. He nodded once, twice. All right, he said. He placed the bag with the soccer ball on the porch rail where he had set the banana bread days earlier, as if the rail had become the only place he was allowed to set anything down. He turned, walked down the steps and felt the weight of his years stack under his knees. On the sidewalk he paused, told himself to breathe, told himself houses were never perfect the first day the roof went on. Behind him he heard the door close and the deadbolt slide, a sound he knew the way a carpenter knows a saw. It did not sound like safety. It sounded like separation. He drove without seeing much of the road, the world smearing into wet grays and greens. At home, he set his keys on the hall table and missed the soft clatter Linda's keys used to make beside them. He walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, left it full on the counter, and kept walking to the garage where the light smelled like oil and old rain. He opened the drawer where he kept important papers and took out the manila folder of the house. He sat at the workbench with the folder before him like a map, to a place that had led him somewhere else entirely. Thomas flipped through the contract pages he had signed with so much hope. He read the lines that named him as owner. He read the clerk's neat notation of the parcel number. He read the clause that gave him, and only him, the authority to lease, to sell, to change locks, to do the 1,000 things owners can do. He had not cared about that power when he'd signed. He cared now because he felt, for the first time since Linda died, that he was being pushed out of a life he had built with his bare hands. He closed the folder and put his palms flat on it as if pressing on a wound. He was not angry, not yet. He was something colder, the temperature a man reaches when he has been standing in the rain too long and suddenly realizes he is wet. He went inside and made tea he did not drink. He stared at the wall until the light changed. He called Frank. "Come over," Frank said. "I'll make stew. You can curse into the pot and it'll steam the cuss words away." Thomas laughed, a short, unpracticed sound. "She told me not to come back," he said when he reached Frank's kitchen. "Not for a while, maybe forever." Frank ladled stew into bowls the size of hubcaps. "Say it again," he said. "Put the words in the air so they don't live in your chest." "They said I'm not welcome in the house I bought." Thomas swallowed. "They said they need to breathe." Frank set a spoon beside the bowl and met his eyes. "So breathe," he said, "and then decide what kind of air you want to be for them." Thomas turned the spoon with his fingers. "I don't want revenge." "I know," Frank said. "You want respect." "I want a door that opens when I knock." Frank poured them both a finger of whiskey and pushed one across the table. "You have to decide if you're going to keep knocking at a door someone's bolted," he said, "or if you're going to build a door of your own and let them find their way to it." Thomas considered the folder he had left on the workbench at home. "I built that door already," he said. "I gave them the key. They changed the rules." "People do," Frank said. He lifted his glass. "To clear rules, then." They drank. The stew was good in the way food can be once you've said aloud the thing you were afraid to say. Thomas felt something settle in him that was not shame and not fury, a steadiness that came from knowing what was true even if it hurt. He drove home under a sky that had finally wrung itself dry. At the kitchen table he unfolded a legal pad and wrote in a hand that had measured rafters and marked window centers. "Respect is a two-way street." He underlined it. He wrote beneath, "Rights exist to protect love, not replace it." He underlined that too. He slept a few hours, shallow and dreamless, and woke before dawn to a house that felt hollow in places he could not name. He showered, shaved, and put on a clean shirt. In the garage, he picked up the manila folder and slipped it into his briefcase, a relic from the days he still carried estimates and invoices to job sites. He stood in the quiet, listening to the small machinery of the morning, the refrigerator hum, the heater's first cough, and then he squared his shoulders like a man preparing to lift something heavier than himself. He did not rehearse what he would say. He trusted the truth to remember itself when the time came. He locked his door, walked to the truck, and set the briefcase on the seat beside him. On Maple Grove the lawns shone with dew and the flags stirred. He parked at the curb and watched the house awake, lights clicking on in the kitchen, a shade drawing up in the downstairs den, a silhouette crossing the hall. He stepped out with the briefcase in hand and climbed the porch. He knocked his 3 soft knocks and waited, his heart steady, his face clear, the weight of paper familiar and suddenly, strangely necessary. Thomas stood on the porch with the briefcase in his hand, its weight and anchor pulling him into the moment. The early light was thin, almost silver, and it fell across the freshly painted front door that he had once chosen himself, a deep navy blue meant to say welcome to the world. Now it felt like the door to a stranger's house. He heard footsteps inside, the muffled shuffle of socks on hardwood, and then the scrape of the deadbolt turning. The door cracked open just far enough for Mark's face to appear. "Dad," Mark said, eyebrows rising in surprise. "It's early." "I know," Thomas replied. His voice was even calm, though his chest felt like it carried a storm. "Can I come in?" Mark hesitated. "Sophie's still asleep. Ella's getting ready for school." "I won't stay long." Thomas glanced past his son into the hallway, catching sight of the family photos on the wall, Ella's school portrait, the beach trip last summer, a wedding picture of Mark and Sophie. Not a single frame with him in it. He swallowed hard. "But I think it's time we talked." Mark opened the door a little wider, just enough for Thomas to step inside. The air smelled of toast and laundry detergent. In the kitchen, a small pink backpack sat on a chair, unzipped, with a lunchbox peeking out. Thomas set the briefcase on the dining table. It made a soft thud that seemed louder than it should. "What's this about?" Mark asked, his voice guarded. Thomas clicked open the latches and pulled out the manila folder. He laid it flat, slid the first page toward his son. "This," he said, "is the deed to the house." Mark looked at the paper but didn't touch it. "Yeah, we've talked about this before." "No, we've avoided talking about it," Thomas corrected. "And maybe that's my fault. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I didn't make it a big deal, you'd feel more at home here, but I see now it hasn't worked. You still feel like you're living in my shadow." Mark's jaw tightened. "Sophie feels." "This isn't just about Sophie," Thomas said, gently but firmly. "It's about you and me. It's about respect. I gave you this house because I wanted you and your family to have a place where you could feel safe. Not to control you, not to make you feel small, but I never expected to be treated like I don't belong in the home I bought for my own son." Mark's eyes dropped to the table. "It's not that simple, Dad." Thomas leaned back, folding his hands on the folder. "It's exactly that simple. I have never once told you how to live here. I've never asked you for rent, never asked you to pay back a cent. All I've ever wanted was to be part of your life, to see Ella grow up, to be welcome." "Dad," Mark began, but Thomas held up a hand. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here because things can't stay the way they are. You've asked me to keep my distance. I heard you, but distance works both ways. If I'm not welcome in this house, then maybe I need to reconsider who this house is for." Mark's eyes flicked up, sudden and sharp. "What are you saying?" Thomas opened the folder again and pulled out another document, a lease agreement. "I'm saying there are plenty of families who would be grateful to live here, families who would open the door when I knocked, who wouldn't treat me like a burden." Mark's voice rose. "You'd throw us out." "I'd give you time," Thomas said, "and I'd help you find another place. But I won't keep pouring my heart into something only to be shut out of it. That's not love, that's servitude." There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of Ella's laughter drifting from upstairs. Mark finally spoke, his voice lower now. "This is going to destroy everything between us." Thomas shook his head. "No, this was supposed to be a foundation, but you can't build a home on a foundation you don't respect." He closed the folder, slid the papers back inside, and locked the briefcase. From the corner of his eye, Thomas saw Sophie standing at the kitchen doorway, hair tousled from sleep, arms crossed. She'd heard enough to know exactly what was at stake. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice tight. "Completely," Thomas said. He picked up the briefcase and headed for the door. "You'll have my decision by the end of the week." He stepped out into the crisp morning air, feeling the weight in his hand but also a strange lightness in his chest. For the first time in months, maybe years, he wasn't just reacting to what his family decided. He was deciding for himself. As he walked to his truck, he heard the front door close behind him. Not with the sharp finality of a slammed door, but with a dull, uncertain thud, like a chapter ending before anyone was ready. The engine turned over and Thomas drove away, the maple trees lining the street blurring past. In the rearview mirror, the house shrank, its navy door still catching the morning light, a color meant for welcome, but now guarding something else entirely. Thomas didn't go home right away. Instead, he drove to the county clerk's office, a squat brick building with faded green shutters and a flag snapping in the wind. It was the kind of place where the floors smelled faintly of floor polish and paper, where the people behind the counter recognized you not because you were famous, but because you'd lived here long enough to become part of the wallpaper. He walked through the double glass doors, briefcase in hand, nodding at the receptionist. "Morning, Mr. Reed," she said, her voice warm but curious. "Haven't seen you here since you filed the deed on that new house." "That's exactly why I'm here," Thomas replied. "Need to check on a few things about that property." He sat at a side desk while a clerk, a young man with a tidy beard, pulled the file from the archives. Thomas spread the papers out like blueprints on a workbench, his fingers running over each line. There it was in black and white. Owner Thomas Everett Reed, sole owner. Full authority to lease, sell, or modify occupancy. The young clerk glanced at him. "Everything look in order." "It does," Thomas said. "One more question, what's the process if I want to change the locks on a property I own?" The clerk blinked. You don't need our permission for that, sir. You just hire a locksmith. As long as the property's yours, you have that right." Thomas closed the folder with a soft snap. "That's what I thought." On the drive home, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting light across the fields. Thomas remembered Linda once telling him that the sun didn't care about the storms. It always came back when it was ready. He wondered if that's what he was doing now, coming back to himself after years of putting everyone else first. He didn't call Mark or Sophie that day. He didn't stop by. He let the silence stretch like a beam across an open span, waiting to see how much weight it could hold. By Wednesday, he had an appointment with an old friend from his construction days, Bill Harmon, now a locksmith. They met in the driveway of the Maple Grove house, the maple leaves crunching underfoot. Bill was a broad-shouldered man with laugh lines etched deep, but his eyes sharpened when Thomas explained the situation. "You're sure about this, Tom?" Bill asked, his hand resting on the latch of his toolbox. "As sure as I've been about anything in a long time," Thomas said. It took less than an hour. The soft click of tumblers falling into place felt almost surgical. Thomas kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see Sophie's silhouette, but the house stayed still. Bill handed him a small envelope with 2 new brass keys inside. "That's that," Bill said. "No one's getting in without these." Thomas weighed the keys in his palm. "I'll need a couple extra copies, and a lock for the back door too." Bill raised an eyebrow but didn't question him. "I'll have them ready tomorrow." That night, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with the briefcase open and a yellow legal pad beside it. He began making a list. 1. Contact rental agency. 2. Set rent price. 3. Post notice. Halfway down the page, his pen hovered. He added a 4th line. 4. Give them one last chance. He stared at that line for a long time. He wasn't a man who enjoyed ultimatums. But love without respect wasn't love at all. It was charity. And charity without gratitude became something bitter. 2 days later, he called Mark. "Can we meet?" Thomas asked. "Is this about the other morning?" Mark's tone was wary. "It's about everything," Thomas said. "Saturday, noon, the diner." When Saturday came, Thomas arrived early. He sat in his usual booth, the one where Linda used to join him for pie after church. He ordered coffee and waited. Mark walked in right on time, but Sophie was with him. She slid into the booth opposite Thomas without a greeting. "Let's make this quick," she said. Thomas folded his hands on the table. "I'll get to the point. I own the house, legally, and I've decided I won't continue letting people live there if I'm not welcome in it." Mark shifted uncomfortably. Sophie's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening us?" "I'm telling you the truth," Thomas said evenly. "If things don't change, if I'm not allowed to be part of that home, I'll have no choice but to lease it to someone else. You'll have to find another place to live." "You can't just," Mark began. "I can," Thomas interrupted, his voice still calm but iron underneath. "And I will if I have to." The silence that followed was heavy. Mark glanced at Sophie, who stared back at Thomas with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "I don't want it to come to that," Thomas continued. "But I've spent my life building homes. And I know this. When a house starts pushing you out, you either fix what's broken or you leave it behind. I'm giving you the chance to fix it." Neither of them answered. Thomas slid a folded sheet of paper across the table. "That's a copy of the deed. Read it, understand it, and then decide if you want to keep living there with the door open to me or start packing." He stood, dropped a few bills on the table for his coffee, and left without looking back. At home that evening, Thomas placed the 2 new brass keys on his nightstand. The decision was made, even if the timing wasn't. He didn't know what they would choose, but for the first time in months, he knew exactly what he would do if they chose wrong. Saturday morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of air that felt washed clean by the week's earlier rain. Thomas woke early, long before the sun cleared the horizon, and sat at the kitchen table with a single cup of coffee. The 2 new brass keys lay beside his mug, gleaming like a decision made and polished overnight. He had given them their chance. A full week since the diner. No call from Mark, no message from Sophie, no invitation to come by, no suggestion of sitting down to talk things through. Just silence, a silence that said everything without using a single word. By mid-morning, Thomas was in his truck, heading toward Maple Grove with the briefcase on the passenger seat. His stomach was steady, his mind sharper than it had been in months. He had spent his life making blueprints, measuring twice, cutting once. Today felt like another build, only the raw material was his own dignity. When he pulled up to the curb, he could see a silver SUV in the driveway, Sophie's car. He didn't plan to sneak in. This wasn't about hiding what he was doing, it was about being absolutely clear. Bill's van was already parked on the street, the side panel reading Harmon's locksmith service. Bill stepped out, toolbox in hand, and gave Thomas a questioning look. "Still sure?" "More than ever," Thomas said. The work began quickly. The front door lock came off in minutes, the soft clink of metal against the porch boards the only sound besides the hum of a lawn mower somewhere down the street. Thomas kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting Sophie to appear. She did. The curtain in the front room twitched, and a moment later the door swung open, not all the way, just a foot. Sophie stood there in leggings and a sweatshirt, her hair pulled into a tight bun. "What is going on?" she demanded, eyes flicking to Bill, then back to Thomas. "Changing the locks," Thomas said simply. "You can't do that," her voice sharpened. "I can," Thomas replied, "and I own this house. I warned both of you what would happen if I was shut out." From deeper inside the house he heard footsteps, Mark's. A moment later his son was beside her, face pale. "Dad, what are you doing?" "Following through," Thomas said. "I told you I wouldn't keep being a ghost in a home I bought. You made your choice." Mark stepped out onto the porch, lowering his voice. "We just needed more time." "You had it," Thomas cut in, "and you used it to say nothing." Sophie's voice rose again. "We have a child in here, Thomas. You're really going to throw your granddaughter out?" Thomas looked at her evenly. "No, I'm giving her parents the consequences of the way they've treated the man who made this place possible. What happens next is on you." Bill, sensing the weight of the moment, worked faster. The new deadbolt slid into place with a click that sounded final. He handed Thomas the fresh key. "That's the front done," Bill said. "Back door next." "Yes," Thomas said. Mark stared at his father like he was seeing him for the first time. "This is cruel," he said. "This is clarity," Thomas answered. "I spent my life building things to last, but if the people living in them don't value what they've been given, they end up tearing it down from the inside. I'm not going to watch that happen." By the time Bill finished the back door, Sophie had taken Ella upstairs, the sound of the little girl's voice faint and questioning. Thomas's chest tightened at that sound, but he forced himself to focus. He left an envelope on the kitchen counter, one key, a printed notice giving them 30 days to vacate, and a short letter in his own handwriting. "Mark, I love you. I love Ella, but I will not be treated like a stranger in the home I built for you. This is not punishment, it's self-respect. You have 1 month to decide where you want to live. If you want to stay here, you'll need to make it a place where I am welcome. If not, I'll find tenants who will. Dad. He took one last look around the kitchen. The granite counters Sophie had admired the first day, the open shelving he'd installed himself so she could display the dishes she loved. Then he stepped outside, locking the door behind him. Bill handed him the extra keys. You okay? Thomas pocketed them. I will be. He drove straight to the office of a local rental agency. The manager, a middle-aged woman named Karen, listened quietly as Thomas explained the situation. So you want to list it immediately? She asked. Yes, Thomas said, and I want the listing to be clear. The owner values respect and responsibility as much as timely rent. Karen smiled faintly. Not a phrase I see often in contracts, but I can make it work. That night, Thomas sat on his back porch with a mug of tea, the spring air cool on his skin. He thought of Linda, how she would have handled this with more grace, maybe even found a way to keep everyone happy. But then he remembered something she once told him after they'd had to evict a tenant from their first rental property. Sometimes loving someone means not letting them take advantage of you. He breathed in deeply, the smell of cut grass drifting from somewhere down the block. The locks were changed. The notice was delivered. The listing would be live by Monday. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was a line drawn straight and level like the frame of a house before the walls went up, a boundary strong enough to hold. By Monday morning, the sign was already in the ground. It stood in the middle of the front lawn of the Maple Grove house, the white post bright against the green grass, the red and white placard swinging gently in the breeze. For rent in bold, block letters. Beneath it, the name of the rental agency and a phone number in black. Thomas had asked Karen to put it up early, before the listing even went live online, because he wanted the first message to be unmissable, not hidden in an email, not tucked in an envelope, a message you could see from halfway down the street. Mark and Sophie returned home that afternoon with Ella in the back seat, still in her school uniform. It was Sophie who saw the sign first. What the hell? She said, the words sharp and low. She slammed the gearshift into park right there in the driveway, her eyes locked on the sign as though staring hard enough might erase it. Ella leaned forward between the seats. Mommy, why does our house say for rent? Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Go inside, sweetie. Mommy and I will be in a minute. Ella's little brow furrowed, but she unbuckled and hopped out, skipping up to the porch without a clue of the storm about to break. Inside the truck, Sophie turned on Mark. He actually did it, Mark cut her off. We knew he might, he told us. You thought he was bluffing, Sophie snapped. And so did I, but look at it, Mark. The neighbors are going to see, everyone is going to talk. Across the street, Mrs. Callahan was already peering out from behind her lace curtains, her phone in hand. Down the block, two teenage boys on bikes slowed to read the sign, their heads swiveling between the placard and the house. Mark swore under his breath. We need to call him. You mean confront him, Sophie said, her voice rising. Thomas answered on the second ring. Mark, what is this? Mark's voice was tight. The sign, people are already asking questions. It's exactly what I told you would happen, Thomas said evenly. The notice is in the envelope I left you. 30 days. You can still choose to make this right. You're humiliating us. Sophie's voice broke in from beside Mark, loud enough for Thomas to hear. No, Thomas replied, I'm giving you clarity. If you want to stay in that house, then start treating me like I belong in it. If you can't do that, you need to leave. You'd rather rent to strangers than keep this in the family? Mark asked. I'd rather rent to people who open the door when I knock, Thomas said. That night, Thomas drove by Maple Grove again, not to gloat, but because he needed to see the truth for himself. The porch light was on. Through the window, he saw Sophie pacing in the living room, phone pressed to her ear. Mark sat on the couch, head in his hands. The sign swayed slightly in the cool night air, catching the light from the street lamp. By Wednesday, the neighborhood had turned curious whispers into a full-blown hum. At the diner, two men at the counter were talking about it when Thomas walked in. Did you hear about the Reeds? Renting the place out already. Guess the son's moving. Shame, nice house. Thomas didn't correct them. He ordered his coffee, sat at his corner booth, and stared out the window. Karen had already left him a voicemail. 2 families had called about the house, both eager to view it by the weekend. On Friday afternoon, Thomas got a text from Mark. "Can we meet? Just us." They sat at a park bench by the river. The spring sun glittered off the water, and for a moment, Thomas could almost imagine it was just another father-son chat, the kind they used to have after working a long Saturday together. Mark started quietly. "Ella's confused. She thinks she did something wrong." Thomas's chest tightened. "Make sure she knows she didn't. This is between us." "She asked if she could still come to your house," Mark said, eyes fixed on the water. "I told her yes." "She's always welcome," Thomas said. Mark took a long breath. "Sophie's furious. She says we should just leave rather than give in." But he trailed off. "But," Mark met his father's gaze for the first time in weeks. "I don't want to lose this house, and I don't want to lose you, but I can't have you here every other day either. We need boundaries that work for both of us." Thomas thought of Linda, of the countless times she'd found the middle ground between his stubbornness and Mark's pride. "Boundaries I can work with," Thomas said slowly, "as long as they don't mean I'm shut out of your life. Or Ella's. I'll call before I visit. I won't interfere, but when I knock, the door opens." "Agreed." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "Agreed." By Saturday, the sign was gone. Thomas stood in the driveway with Mark, the 2 of them watching as Karen's assistant pulled it out of the lawn and loaded it into the back of a van. Inside the house, Ella's laughter floated down the hallway. For the first time in a long time, Thomas felt the place might finally live up to its name, a home. Thomas didn't expect the first weeks after the sign came down to feel so strange. The house at Maple Grove was no longer a battlefield, but it wasn't yet a place of easy laughter either. Everything between him, Mark, and Sophie moved in careful, measured steps, like a dance where no one wanted to step on the other's toes. He honored his promise. Every visit began with a call. Sometimes it was the same morning, sometimes the night before. If Sophie answered, she kept her tone neutral, polite. If Mark picked up, his voice carried a little more warmth, but also a certain tentativeness, like a man afraid of slipping back into old patterns. One Wednesday afternoon, Thomas stopped by after calling ahead. He carried a box of tools, not because the house needed fixing, but because Ella had asked him to build her a birdhouse for the backyard. Sophie met him at the door. "She's been talking about this all morning," she said, and for the first time in months there was no edge in her voice, only genuine amusement. In the garage, Thomas laid out the wooden panels he'd cut at home. Ella knelt beside him, handing him nails one by one. "We'll paint it yellow," she announced, "so the birds know it's a happy house." Thomas smiled. "I think that's the best idea I've heard all week." Sophie watched from the doorway, her arms folded, not defensively this time, but in a way that looked almost protective. Mark came home early that day. He stood in the yard watching his father and daughter paint the birdhouse under the fading sun. "She's happier when you're here," he said quietly to Sophie, who was standing beside him. Sophie didn't answer right away. "She's happy because he's listening to her. That's a good thing." It wasn't an apology, not yet, but Thomas saw it from the corner of his eye and knew it was as close as she could get for now. 2 weeks later, they invited him for dinner. It was Mark's idea. "Nothing fancy," he'd said over the phone. "Just spaghetti. Ella wants you to see the birdhouse in the morning light." When Thomas arrived, the kitchen smelled of garlic and fresh bread. Sophie handed him a glass of iced tea without being asked. "We're glad you could make it," she said simply. Over dinner, conversation came in slow waves, Mark talking about work, Thomas sharing stories from his construction days, Ella chattering about school. The tension in the room softened with each passing minute, replaced by something that felt almost like the way it used to be. After they'd cleared the table, Thomas stepped out onto the porch with Mark. The street was quiet, the sky deepening to a soft blue. "You know," Mark said, leaning against the railing, "I've been thinking about what you said about respect." Thomas waited. "I think I forgot," Mark continued, "that respect goes both ways. I kept worrying you'd take over when really, I was the one shutting you out, and that wasn't fair." Thomas put a hand on his son's shoulder. "We all forget sometimes. The important thing is remembering before it's too late. Mark nodded. I want you to know you'll always be welcome here, not just because of the deed, but because you're my dad. Inside, Sophie was helping Ella into pajamas. Thomas paused in the hallway. Thank you for dinner, he said. Sophie looked up, meeting his eyes. Thank you for giving us another chance. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was real. That night as Thomas drove home, the porch light at Maple Grove glowed behind him, a warm, steady beacon. He realized that a house's value wasn't in its price or even in the name on the deed. It was in the people willing to make room for each other inside it. The locks were still new. The boundaries still stood, but so did the bridge they'd started to rebuild. The summer heat settled in early that year, heavy and unrelenting. Even the evenings felt warm, the kind of air that clung to your shirt and made the grass smell sweeter. Thomas was halfway through sanding an old cedar bench on his back porch when his phone rang. It was Mark, and from the sound of his voice, something was wrong. Dad, we're at County General. Sophie had to bring Ella in. Thomas set the sander down immediately. What happened? She fell off the monkey bars at the park. Landed wrong on her arm. They think it might be broken. I'm on my way, Thomas said, already reaching for his keys. At the hospital, the hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. Mark met him outside the pediatric wing, looking pale and worn. They're doing X-rays, he said. She's scared, keeps asking for you. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Where's Sophie? In with her. They walked together to the exam room. Through the glass, Thomas saw Ella sitting on the table, her little arm in a temporary splint, tears on her cheeks. Sophie sat beside her, brushing damp hair from her forehead. When Sophie saw Thomas, she didn't hesitate. She stood and motioned him in. She's been waiting, she said softly. Thomas went to Ella's side, taking her uninjured hand gently in his. Hey, sunshine, he murmured. I heard you were showing off your flying skills. Ella sniffled. I fell. Every great flyer does sooner or later, Thomas said. But the best part, you get back up, and you'll be back on those monkey bars before the summer's over. She leaned into him, her head against his chest, and Thomas felt her breathing slow. Sophie watched from the other side of the room, her eyes softer than he'd ever seen them. The doctor came in with the X-rays. Yes, the arm was broken, but it was a clean fracture. A bright pink cast would do the trick. As they fitted it, Thomas stayed right beside Ella, telling her stories from his construction days, about beams that needed patching and ladders that wobbled, about the time he misjudged a step and landed in a wheelbarrow. Ella giggled, even through the twinges of pain. Later, in the waiting area, Sophie turned to Thomas. Thank you for coming. I know, I haven't always made it easy for you to be part of things. But tonight, she stopped, glanced at Mark, then back at Thomas. Tonight reminded me why it matters that you are. Thomas nodded, his voice quiet. I told you before, I don't need to be in charge. I just need to be here for her, for both of you. Mark put a hand on his father's shoulder. You are, and we want it to stay that way. They left the hospital together, the night air cooler now, carrying the smell of rain somewhere far off. Thomas walked them to their car. Ella, already drowsy from the pain medicine, lifted her casted arm to wave at him. See you tomorrow, Grandpa, she mumbled. Thomas smiled. Count on it. Driving home, he realized something had shifted for good. It wasn't the paperwork or the locks or even the boundaries they'd set months ago. It was trust, earned the hard way but solid now, like a well-set foundation. Maple Grove wasn't just his house anymore. It was their home. And finally, it was a place where he could walk through the door without hesitation. The leaves along Maple Grove Street had just begun to turn, flecks of gold and crimson catching in the early autumn sunlight. Thomas pulled his truck into the driveway, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Today wasn't just any Saturday. It was Ella's 7th birthday, and for the first time since he'd handed over the keys to this house, he felt like he belonged inside it. From the open windows came the sound of balloons squeaking against each other, children's laughter, and Sophie's voice directing someone to tie that one to the chair. When Thomas stepped out of the truck, the scent of vanilla frosting and grilled hamburgers drifted through the air. Sophie met him at the door, smiling without the guarded politeness of old. "You made it," she said, her eyes warm. "Come in, we saved you a seat next to Ella." Inside, the living room was strung with pink and yellow streamers. The coffee table had been moved to one side to make room for a low table covered in markers and sheets of construction paper. Half a dozen kids sat cross-legged, drawing crowns and birthday cards. Ella spotted him first. "Grandpa!" she shouted, bounding across the room with her still pink cast freshly freed just a week ago. She hugged him fiercely. "You're here." Thomas knelt to her level. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, sunshine. You're the star today." He'd brought a large, flat box wrapped in brown paper. "Open it later," he said with a wink. "It's something for your backyard." She grinned and ran back to her friends. Sophie caught his arm. "I can't believe you built that playhouse," she whispered. "Mark showed me the pictures. It's incredible." "I had some spare wood," Thomas said modestly, though he'd spent weeks designing it to fit perfectly under the maple tree in their yard. Yellow walls, white trim, and a little porch just big enough for a tea party. As the party went on, Thomas found himself moving easily between the adults and children. He manned the grill with Mark, swapping stories while flipping burgers. He joined the kids in coloring crowns, letting Ella put one on his head. Sophie even handed him the camera at one point and asked him to take a few family photos, something she never would have done before. When it was time for cake, the entire room crowded into the dining area. Mark dimmed the lights, Sophie carried in the cake, and Ella beamed at the circle of faces singing to her. Thomas stood just behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. As she blew out the candles, she turned to him. "Grandpa, I made a wish, but I think it already came true." "Oh, what's that?" Thomas asked, smiling. "That you'd always be here." Later, after the presents were opened and the kids had scattered to play in the yard, Sophie joined Thomas on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the street in amber light. "I want to say something," she began, her voice careful. "These past months you've shown me what it means to be part of a family without stepping on anyone's toes. You've been patient with me even when I didn't deserve it." Thomas shook his head. "We both had learning to do." She took a breath. "I was wrong to shut you out. You're not just part of this home because of the deed. You're part of it because you've built it, literally and figuratively, with love. I see that now." Inside, Ella's laughter rang out from the backyard where the playhouse stood, its little porch light glowing in the dusk. For Thomas, the sound was richer than any music. This was what he'd fought for, not control, not ownership, but the chance to stand in the heart of his family's life and know he was wanted there. He looked at Sophie, then at Mark, who had joined them on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. "Here's to building something that lasts," Thomas said. Mark clinked his mug against his father's. Together, he agreed, and for the first time Thomas believed it. The first snow of the year came early, drifting down in slow, lazy spirals that made the whole neighborhood look like it had been dusted with powdered sugar. Thomas was sitting in his living room, the fire crackling low. When the phone rang, it was Mark, his voice tight. "Dad, we've had a break-in." Thomas was already on his feet. "Is everyone okay?" "Yeah, we were out when it happened, but they forced the back door. The cops are here now, can you come?" When Thomas arrived at Maple Grove, the flashing blue lights bounced off the snow, making the whole street seem unreal. He found Sophie on the porch, her arms wrapped around Ella, who looked wide-eyed but unhurt. "They didn't take much," Sophie said, "but it feels like they took safety." Inside, an officer was dusting for prints. The back door's lock hung broken, the wood around it splintered. Mark stood nearby, looking both angry and shaken. Thomas's eyes went straight to the doorframe. "I can fix this tonight," he said, "but I'll make it stronger than before. No one's kicking this in again." For the next 2 hours, Thomas worked quietly, replacing the frame, fitting a reinforced lock, checking every hinge. Mark held the flashlight, Sophie fetched tools without being asked, and Ella sat at the kitchen table coloring, occasionally glancing over as if to make sure her grandpa was still there. When he finished, Thomas stepped back. "Try it now." Mark shut the door and gave it a hard shove. It didn't budge. "Solid," Mark said, and for the first time that night his shoulders eased. They sat together afterward, coffee mugs in hand, the kitchen warm against the cold pressing in from outside. Sophie looked at Thomas over the rim of her mug. I don't know what we would have done if you weren't here." "You'd have figured it out," Thomas said, though a quiet swell of pride moved through him. "No," Mark said, his voice firm. "We wouldn't have. You've always been the one who shows up when it matters most. That hasn't changed." Before leaving, Thomas checked every window, every lock, and showed Mark a few tricks to make the place safer. At the door, Ella hugged him hard. "You made the bad guys stay away," she whispered. Thomas kissed the top of her head. "I made sure they'll think twice before they try again." Driving home through the snow, Thomas realized something important. He no longer wondered whether he belonged at Maple Grove. The question was gone, replaced by a certainty as solid as the lock he'd just installed. It wasn't just his house on paper anymore. It was his family's home in every way that mattered. And now, they all knew it too. The snow stuck around for a week, piling up along the curbs and frosting the roofs in neat, white lines. Life at Maple Grove settled back into its rhythm, school drop-offs, work commutes, weekend errands, but something subtle had shifted after the break-in. It wasn't just that the locks were stronger. The air inside the house felt warmer, less guarded, like a room where someone had opened the curtains for the first time in years. One Friday evening, as Thomas was finishing dinner at his own place, his phone buzzed with an unexpected text from Sophie. "Mark's working late. Ella's asleep. Would you like to come over for tea?" Thomas stared at the screen for a long moment. Sophie had never invited him over alone before. He typed back, "I'll be there in 15. The house was quiet when he arrived, the soft glow from the kitchen spilling into the hall. Sophie was at the counter, pouring steaming water into 2 mugs. She wore a thick cardigan, her hair down for once, and there was a stillness about her he hadn't seen before. "Hope you like chamomile," she said. "Perfect," Thomas replied, taking a seat at the table. They sipped in silence for a minute, the kind of quiet that felt comfortable rather than strained. "I wanted to tell you something," Sophie began, her hands curled around the mug. "Something I probably should have said a long time ago." Thomas waited. "My father left when I was 8, she said. "Just walked out one day, no goodbye, no note. My mom did her best, but," she gave a small shrug. "It was always just us after that, and I think without realizing it I started guarding my space, guarding Ella's space. I didn't want anyone to come in and then disappear again." Her eyes lifted to meet his. "When you gave us this house, it scared me, because it felt too big a gift from someone who might vanish. And I know now that was unfair to you, but at the time I didn't know how else to feel." Thomas felt the words settle in him. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said softly. "And I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like I'd walk away. I won't, not from Mark, not from Ella, and Sophie, not from you either. You're part of my family now." She nodded, her eyes bright. "I believe you. I didn't at first. I do now." They sat there a while longer, talking about small things, Ella's reading progress, Mark's latest project at work, the snow forecast for the weekend. But under it all, Thomas felt the last of the old tension dissolve, like ice melting in a slow-running stream. When he stood to leave, Sophie walked him to the door. "Thank you for coming," she said. "And thank you for staying, even when I didn't make it easy." Thomas smiled. "That's what family does, we stay." Driving home through the quiet streets, he realized this was the final piece he hadn't known he was waiting for, not just being welcome in the house, but being trusted in the hearts of everyone who lived there. Maple Grove wasn't just a house he'd built with money and wood. It was a home he'd built, brick by brick, out of patience, forgiveness, and the kind of love that stays put no matter what. The thaw came slowly that year. Snow retreated in patches, revealing the soft, damp earth beneath. By late March, the air smelled faintly of mud and new beginnings, and Thomas found himself spending more afternoons on his back porch, fixing up small projects for the house at Maple Grove. One Thursday evening, Mark called. His voice carried a touch of amusement. "Dad, you might want to come to Ella's school tomorrow. She's in the spring assembly." Thomas chuckled. "You telling me this now because you forgot or because you wanted to surprise me?" "Bit of both," Mark admitted. "But she asked if you could sit in the front row, said she wanted you to hear her words up close." The next morning, Thomas arrived early at the elementary school, the scent of crayons and floor wax greeting him as he stepped into the auditorium. The folding chairs filled quickly with parents and grandparents, cameras at the ready. Sophie waved him over to a front row seat beside her. Ella's class was scheduled last. The assembly rolled through songs, short skits, and a science demonstration involving vinegar and baking soda. Then Ella stepped up to the microphone, a stack of index cards in her small hands. She looked out at the crowd, spotted Thomas, and smiled so wide it nearly broke him. "My name is Ella Reed," she began, her voice clear, "and my project is called The Person Who Builds More Than Houses." A ripple of curiosity went through the room. "This person," she read, "built our birdhouse, our playhouse, and even the big house we live in. But he also builds other things you can't see. He builds time to listen to me. He builds ways to keep me safe. He builds smiles when I'm sad. He builds a family that stays together no matter what." She looked up from her cards. "This person is my grandpa, Thomas Reed." For a moment, Thomas couldn't breathe. The room applauded, some parents smiling at him knowingly. Sophie's hand found his and gave it a small squeeze. Ella finished by holding up a drawing she'd made. The yellow playhouse under the maple tree, the big house behind it, and three figures, her dad, and Thomas, standing together. Above them, in uneven letters, she had written, "Home is people, not walls." After the assembly and the bustle of parents collecting backpacks and hugging their kids, Ella ran straight into his arms. "Did you like it?" she asked breathlessly. "More than you'll ever know," Thomas said, his voice thick. "You gave the best speech I've ever heard." Sophie stood beside them, her eyes bright. She came up with all of it herself. "I didn't even see the cards until this morning." Thomas looked at his granddaughter, her cheeks flushed with pride, and thought, "This is the kind of foundation you can't put on paper. This is the one that lasts." That night he sat at his kitchen table, the drawing propped against a jar of pencils. Outside, the first real spring rain began to fall, gentle and steady. Maple Grove had started as a house he bought to give his son a start. Somewhere along the way, it had become the place where his family finally learned what it meant to live together, with the doors and their hearts open. The first warm wave of spring came in April, coaxing buds from the maple trees and filling the air with the scent of fresh-cut grass. Thomas had just finished repainting the porch rail at his own place when Mark's truck pulled into the driveway. Mark didn't usually drop by unannounced, and when he stepped out, Thomas noticed something in his son's posture, a tightness, like he was holding news too big to carry casually. "Got a minute?" Mark asked. "Always," Thomas said, setting down the brush and wiping his hands on an old rag. They sat on the back porch, the boards still warm from the afternoon sun. Mark stared at the yard for a long moment before speaking. "I got a job offer," he said finally. "Out of state, Chicago." Thomas's stomach dipped, but he kept his voice steady. "Big step," Mark nodded. "Big promotion, better pay, good school district for Ella. It's everything we've been working toward." He paused, "But it means leaving Maple Grove." Thomas leaned back, letting the words settle. The image of the house came into his mind, Ella's playhouse under the maple tree, the birdhouse swaying in the wind, the porch light glowing in the dusk. He thought of the years it had taken for that place to become more than wood and stone, to become a true home. "Have you told Sophie?" he asked. "She's excited about the opportunity. Nervous, but excited." "Ella," he sighed. "Ella's not thrilled. She says she doesn't want to leave you." Thomas felt a small ache behind his ribs. "What do you want?" Mark hesitated. "I want the job, but I also want to keep the house in the family. Maybe rent it out for a while, maybe come back to it someday." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the low hum of evening. "When I bought that house," Thomas said slowly, "I thought I was building something for you to start your life in. Turns out, it was where we rebuilt our family. That means more to me than who's living in it day to day." He looked at his son. "If you need to take this job, take it, but don't let go of what we've built unless you're sure you'll never want to walk back through that door." Mark's eyes were steady now. "Then maybe we hold on to it, even if it's just for the summers. I want Ella to have that anchor, and I want you to always feel like it's yours too." The next weekend, they walked the property together, noting the small repairs to make before renting it out, touch-up paint on the trim, a new screen for the back porch. Sophie joined them, her tone warm, even playful, as she joked about the house handover plan. Ella trailed them, quiet, until they reached the playhouse. She turned to Thomas. "If we leave, will you keep this here?" Thomas crouched down to meet her eyes. "I'll keep it right where it is, and when you come back, it'll be waiting for you." That evening they ate dinner together at Maple Grove, the kind of meal that felt like a small celebration rather than a goodbye. There was laughter, the easy kind, and no one avoided the talk about change. As Thomas drove home later, he realized that the fear he'd once had, that losing proximity would mean losing connection, was gone. The bonds they'd built here were strong enough to stretch across miles. Maple Grove would stand, and so would they. The weeks that followed moved faster than Thomas expected. One day, it felt like they were just talking about the move. The next, the garage at Maple Grove was lined with cardboard boxes, each one labeled in Sophie's neat handwriting. Kitchen, Ella's room, books, winter coats. Thomas made it a point to be there every few days, not to hover, but to help in the quiet, practical ways he knew best. He patched a hairline crack in the upstairs wall, repaired the squeaky hinge on the pantry door, oiled the back gate so it would swing without complaint for the new tenants. One Saturday morning, he found Ella in her room surrounded by piles of stuffed animals. She was holding a small brown bear, its fur worn thin. "Grandpa," she asked, "does my bear get to go in a box, or can he ride in the car with me?" "I think a bear like that deserves the front seat," Thomas said. She smiled but didn't let go of the bear. "I'm gonna miss the playhouse." Thomas sat on the floor beside her. "You know how some things stay in the same place even when we leave? That playhouse will be like that. It'll be waiting right here for you, and I will too." In the evening, Sophie worked with Thomas in the kitchen, wrapping plates in newspaper and tucking them into boxes. At first, their conversation stayed on safe topics, recipes, the weather, but gradually they wandered into more personal ground. "You know," she said one night, sealing a box with packing tape, "I used to think you being so involved meant you didn't trust us. Now I realize you were just making sure we had what we needed even when we didn't know it yet." Thomas paused, holding a stack of mugs. "I never wanted to take over. I just wanted to be sure you knew I'd show up." "You did," Sophie said, "and you still are." Mark and Thomas spent a whole Saturday in the garage, sorting tools and storage bins. They worked mostly in companionable silence, the kind that only comes when two people have been through something and come out the other side closer. At one point, Mark held up an old hammer. "You gave me this when I was 12, said if I learned to fix things, I'd always be useful." "You have been," Thomas said, taking the hammer and turning it over in his hands. "But being useful isn't the same as being present. I had to learn that the hard way." Mark gave a small smile. "We both did." As the move-in date for the new tenants approached, Thomas walked through the house one last time with Sophie and Mark. They checked off the list. Fresh coat of paint in the living room, new faucet in the upstairs bathroom, carpet steam cleaned. When they reached the backyard, Ella was already in the playhouse, waving through the little porch window. "You know what I'm gonna do," she announced. "I'm going to send Grandpa a picture every time I visit so he knows it's still perfect." Thomas laughed. "Deal." That night, after they'd locked up, Thomas lingered on the porch alone for a moment. The maple tree's branches swayed above him, casting slow-moving shadows across the siding. He thought about the day he'd first handed over the keys and all the days since. How much had been built here that no one could pack into a box? The house would soon belong, temporarily, to someone else. But the memories, those stayed. And so would the promise he'd made to himself the moment he bought it, that his family would always have a place to come home to. The morning of the move broke clear and cool, a thin mist curling along the edges of Maple Grove Street. Thomas pulled up early, his truck loaded with a thermos of coffee, a box of breakfast sandwiches, and a roll of packing tape, because in his experience there was always one last box that needed sealing. From the driveway he could already hear the low thud of footsteps upstairs and the shuffle of furniture on the hardwood. The front door stood open, letting in the crisp air. Inside, the living room was nearly bare. The couch was gone, the walls stripped of photographs. Sunlight streamed in through uncovered windows, laying bright rectangles on the floor where picture frames had once cast their shadows. Ella came bounding down the stairs in her sneakers, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. "Grandpa, we're almost done," she said, a little breathless. Thomas knelt to hug her. "Almost," he agreed. "But we've got to do it right. Every good goodbye deserves a little time." Sophie emerged from the kitchen, a stack of dish towels in her arms. "We're just finishing the last couple of boxes. The movers will be here in an hour." Her voice held a mix of relief and something softer, nostalgia maybe. Mark appeared behind her carrying a rolled-up rug. "Dad, you wouldn't believe how much dust was under this thing. Thought we were clean people until this morning." Thomas grinned. "Houses keep secrets until the day you move out. Then they tell you everything." After the final boxes were taped shut and set by the door, they moved through the house together for one last walk. Thomas led the way into the living room, his hand brushing the doorway. "This is where you opened the birdhouse kit," he said to Ella. She nodded. "And where we had my 6th birthday cake." In the kitchen, Sophie paused by the counter. "This is where we made cookies for the bake sale the night before, of course, because someone forgot the date." She smiled at Mark, who rolled his eyes. Upstairs, Ella ran from room to room, touching the walls as if memorizing them by feel. In her bedroom, the soft indent where her bed had stood was still visible in the carpet. She stood in it for a moment, then looked up. "I'll remember this spot forever." When they finally reached the backyard, the maple tree swayed gently above the playhouse. Ella darted toward it, disappearing inside for a moment. When she came back out, she carried the little ceramic bird figurine Thomas had given her when they'd first built it. "This will come with me," she said firmly. "So I have a piece of the playhouse even if I can't see it every day." Thomas's throat tightened. Good plan. The movers arrived right on time, loading the truck with quiet efficiency. Soon the driveway was empty except for Thomas's pickup and Sophie's SUV. Before they left, Thomas pulled out the envelope with the spare keys and turned to Mark. "These stay with me," he said. "But they're not just for the tenants. They're for you, if you ever want to come back, no matter how long it's been." Mark closed his hand around his father's. "We will." When the last car pulled away, Thomas stood alone on the porch. He took one last look through the front door, the clean floors, the bare walls, the faint echo of laughter still clinging to the air. He stepped inside just long enough to make sure every window was locked, every light off. Then he pulled the door shut behind him, the new lock clicking solidly into place. He didn't see it as closing the house. He saw it as keeping it safe until the people who belonged here found their way back. The maple leaves rustled above him as he walked to his truck. It sounded almost like a promise. A full year had passed since the day Thomas locked the door at Maple Grove for the last time. The seasons had spun their cycle, spring's green, summer's heat, autumn's gold, and now winter again, though a gentler one than the last. The house had been rented to a young couple with a baby on the way, and Thomas had kept it in perfect condition, stopping by every month to tend the yard, check the gutters, and tighten whatever screws had worked loose. One chilly Saturday morning in late February, his phone rang. "Dad," Mark's voice came warm through the line, "we're coming up for the weekend. Thought we might stop by Maple Grove. Ella's been asking." Thomas felt his heart lift. "I'll meet you there." When he pulled into the familiar driveway, the sky was pale and bright. The maple tree stood bare, its branches etching patterns against the blue. The tenants had agreed to be away for the day, so Thomas could let his family have the place to themselves. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of fresh paint and lemon polish, but beneath that was something deeper, a feeling, a memory, like the faint echo of voices still lingering in the air. Moments later, Sophie's SUV rolled up. Ella was out before the engine stopped, running up the path, her coat flaring behind her. "Grandpa," she called, launching herself into his arms. He hugged her tightly. "Welcome home, sunshine." They walked through the rooms together. Ella pointed out the spots she remembered, the corner where the Christmas tree once stood, the wall where her growth chart had been marked in pencil, the kitchen island where she and Thomas had painted the birdhouse. Sophie ran her fingers along the windowsill. "It's strange," she said softly. It's the same but different, like it's been waiting for us. Mark nodded. It feels good to be here. In the backyard, the playhouse was just as they'd left it. The yellow paint had faded slightly, but it still stood sturdy under the maple's watchful branches. Ella climbed the steps and looked out over the yard. It didn't forget me, she said with satisfaction. Neither did I, Thomas replied. They spent the afternoon there talking, laughing, sharing a simple picnic on the living room floor. No one mentioned the move or the months apart or the distance that had once stretched between them. This was not a day for remembering divisions. It was a day for standing in the same sunlight again. As the shadows grew longer, Thomas locked up the house one more time. But this time it didn't feel like closing a chapter. It felt like placing a bookmark in a story that would be picked up again and again whenever they chose. On the porch, Mark put an arm around his father's shoulder. "Thanks for keeping it for us," he said. Thomas smiled. "Always." Ella slipped her small hand into his. "Grandpa, when we come back next time, can we sleep here?" Thomas squeezed her hand. "We'll see, sunshine, we'll see." And that is today's story. Thank you for listening to Family Shadows. We hope this story has brought you warmth, reflections on family, and the value of mutual respect. Wishing you good health, peace, and happiness with your loved ones. See you again in the next story.